There is a mental photograph that I would like you to construct now in the next 30 seconds, within your imagination. Close your eyes for a moment, if it is safe to do so, and if not, just relax your gaze on the screen. You are in a Gothic cathedral in southern Spain, 13th century. The stone of the walls exudes a damp cold that seeps through clothing and bites at the bones. The colored stained glass filters the light of the setting sun into red, blue, and golden beams that fall onto the marble floor like blood slowly spilled. At the center of the altar, a man dressed in white and gold raises, with both hands, a small circle of baked dough. His eyes are closed, his lips move in Latin, and then, at that exact moment, the tower bell begins to ring. A heavy, deep bell that makes the ground vibrate beneath the feet of 1,000 kneeling faithful. And all those faces, small children, pregnant mothers, veteran soldiers, calloused-handed peasants, nobles in perfumed silks, all of them, without exception, bow down to the ground, touch their foreheads to the cold stone, and believe with absolute certainty that the God who created the universe, that same God who ignited the sun, sculpted the mountains of the Alps, and shaped the face of the first human being, is at this very moment reduced, condensed, imprisoned within that small circle of bread dough raised by the priest's hands. Now change the image. Same moment, same setting sun. But now you are not in the cathedral but outside of it, a few meters from the main door. Sitting on the stone floor is a beggar. He hasn't eaten in 3 days. His stomach aches in a way that you and I, fortunately, have never known. His eyes are sunken, his hands tremble, and he looks inside the church, through the ajar door, and sees that piece of bread being raised in the air. And he thinks, perhaps for the 1,000th time in his life, if that bread in there is really God, and if God is love, and if God is goodness, why doesn't God come down from that altar and come to satisfy my hunger? Why is God's bread there surrounded by gold, candles, and incense, while the real bread, the simple bread, the bread that would feed my stomach today, does not come to me? This beggar, my dear viewer, has asked, in the silence of his own misery, one of the deepest questions in the history of Western philosophy. Only he had no books to write it down, he had no pupils to hear it, he had no printing press to publish it, and he died that very night, frozen outside the cathedral, never knowing that 400 years after him, in a cold and rainy city called Amsterdam, a young Jew in his 20s would take that same question, that same anguish, that same suspicion, born in the empty stomachs of the hungry, and would transform it into the most dangerous philosophical system Europe had ever seen. The name of that young man was Baruch Spinoza. And if you have never heard of him, if his name goes unnoticed in school books, in religion classes, in Sunday sermons, know that this is not an accident. It is a project. It is a construction. It is the result of 4 centuries of careful, deliberate, institutional silencing, executed with the patience of a watchmaker by 3 consecutive generations of theologians, inquisitors, censors, priests, rabbis, pastors, and university rectors who, each in their own way, reached the same inevitable conclusion: that man cannot be read, because those who read Spinoza do not return, because those who understand Spinoza can no longer kneel before an altar without hearing, in the depths of their conscience, a thin, persistent, irritating voice whispering with every repeated gesture, "Why are you doing this? Where did this gesture come from? Who invented this ritual? And, above all, who profits from your belief?" I need you to understand, before we continue, that this story is not a story against faith. Repeat mentally, with me. This story is not against faith. It is not against Christians. It is not against Catholics. It is not against Jews. It is not against anyone who finds in the rituals of their tradition comfort, hope, direction, meaning for difficult days. Spinoza, until the last second of his life, at the age of 44 dying of tuberculosis in a small rented room in The Hague, never denied God. On the contrary, he loved God with an intensity that would shame most theologians of his time. But his God, my dear viewer, was too great to fit in a piece of bread, too great to be swallowed by the human mouth, too great to be manipulated by the hands of men, too great to be sold in the form of indulgences, traded in the form of paid masses, displayed in the form of processions adorned through the streets of European cities. The God of Spinoza was infinite. And an infinite God, by definition, cannot be reduced to anything finite. This is the phrase that will accompany us throughout this journey. Memorize this phrase. Tattoo it in your subconscious. What is infinite cannot be reduced to the finite, without violence, without fraud, without lies. And here, my friend, is the Gordian knot that Spinoza dared to point out with his finger. If God is infinite, then the ritual of the Eucharist, the millennia-old act of transforming a piece of bread into the physical body of God, is, from a strictly logical point of view, a mathematical impossibility. A contradiction that any first-year philosophy student could dismantle in 5 minutes. And yet, here we are in 2026, with rockets traveling to Mars, with artificial intelligence writing poems, with telescopes seeing galaxies that were born shortly after the Big Bang, and still, next Sunday, billions of people will kneel before an altar and believe, without the slightest shadow of a doubt, that that white disk of flour that the priest is holding is in fact concretely, physically, the body of the God who created the infinite. How is this possible? How can a species that sends probes to Jupiter still believe this? How is it that, despite all the scientific revolution, all the critical philosophy, all the centuries of enlightenment and rationality, this ritual remains intact, unshaken, at the heart of Western civilization? It is precisely this question, my dear listener, that Spinoza tried to answer. And the answer he found is of such brutal honesty, such devastation, such discomfort, that I warn you right away that it is not for everyone. Let us walk side by side with that young man in his 20s through the narrow, damp streets of Amsterdam in the 17th century. Let us sit at his table while he writes, by the light of a flickering candle, the words that will make the rabbis tremble with rage. Let us enter in spirit the Portuguese synagogue on July 27, 1656, to witness with our own ears the most terrible curse that the European Jewish community has ever pronounced against one of its own. Let us travel to Rome, where his writings will be placed on the forbidden list of books condemned by the Vatican. Let us visit the clandestine cafes of The Hague, where secret disciples gathered at night to hand-copy excerpts from his manuscripts, risking imprisonment. Let us uncover letters hidden for 3 centuries in locked archives, conversations erased from official records, ideas so radical that even Voltaire, centuries later, would hesitate to cite them. So, before I dive into the narrative itself, I ask you for a favor, just one. If you have made it this far, if you have felt even for a second a small tremor in your chest, a little more curiosity, a sincere desire to understand why so many things that seem so normal are in fact so strange when looked at closely, then stay with me. Because what comes next is not afternoon entertainment. It is a kind of invitation to see the world with different eyes, the eyes of that young man from Amsterdam, the eyes of the hungry beggar at the door of the Spanish cathedral, the eyes of someone who, finally, after centuries of collective slumber, decided to wake up. Eating the body of God has become normal, and it is precisely this normality, my dear viewer, that should, at this very moment, unsettle you to your bones. The journey begins now. Amsterdam, in the year 1654, was not exactly the city that tourists know today. It was a human anthill, built on drained swamps at the cost of lives, where the narrow, tall buildings of Dutch merchants, the discreet synagogues of refugee Jews, the reformed churches of stern Calvinists, and the gigantic warehouses of the Dutch East India Company, that colonial extraction machine that transformed the small Republic of the Netherlands into the richest economic power on the planet that century, stood side by side. In the streets, the smell was a mixture of fresh fish, horse urine, damp wood, Dutch paint, Asian spices, and fireplace smoke. The canals reflected the flickering lights of the windows, as if the entire city were duplicated. One Amsterdam above, another below the water, as if the very geography of the city already suggested to young Baruch that reality always has 2 faces, one visible and the other submerged, and that it is up to the courageous thinker to dive in to discover what is hidden beneath the surface. It was in this city, my dear viewer, that young Baruch Spinoza grew up. The son of Portuguese Jewish merchants who had narrowly escaped the fires of the Iberian Inquisition, he carried from birth a burden that no child should bear, the burden of being the child of the persecuted. His grandparents had seen relatives burned alive in the squares of Lisbon, simply for refusing to renounce the faith of Moses. Great-uncles had hidden Hebrew books within stone walls, risking death if discovered. Cousins had been forced to pretend for decades to eat pork at Sunday lunch, just to avoid drawing the attention of the Holy Office's spies. And now, finally, after generations of flight, fear, and clandestinity, the Spinoza family had arrived at the promised land of the 17th century, Amsterdam, the only European city where a Jew could pray aloud in Hebrew without being tortured the next morning. You can imagine then what kind of gaze little Baruch grew up with. It was a grateful gaze, yes, of course, as every survivor is grateful for survival. But it was, above all, a suspicious gaze. Deeply suspicious. Because he had learned as a child that men kill each other over words, over rituals, over gestures. A Jew ate unleavened bread and died in the fire. A Christian ate leavened bread, consecrated by a priest, and went straight to paradise. The difference between murder and holiness, between death and glory, between hell and heaven, often boiled down to half a spoonful of an ingredient in the baking process. And this realization, my friend, this simple, childlike, almost naive realization, planted in young Spinoza the first seed of a suspicion that would never leave him. If people kill and die over bread, then perhaps there is something very wrong with our way of understanding what is truly sacred. At the age of 7, he was enrolled in the synagogue school known as Talmud Torah. There, under the tutelage of severe and erudite rabbis, he learned to read the Hebrew of the prophets, the Aramaic of the Talmudists, the Spanish of the Sephardic poets, the Portuguese of exiled relatives, the Dutch of neighbors, and later, the Latin of ancient philosophers. By the age of 14, he was already considered the most promising student of his generation. At 16, he could recite entire pages of the Talmud from memory. At 18, he had already read Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, and begun to ask questions that made the rabbis uncomfortable. Small questions for now, discreet questions, but questions that contained, in germ, the storm that was to come. For example, he would ask, "Rabbi, if God is perfect, and if perfection is immutable, how can God have changed his mind about the people in the episode of the golden calf?" Or, "Master, if Moses wrote the Torah, how can the Torah describe the death of Moses himself, which is in the last chapters of the book? Who wrote that part?" The rabbis would respond with evasions, with metaphors, with explanations that required further explanations. And with each insufficient answer, young Baruch would secretly note in a small notebook he kept under his pillow a new doubt, a new contradiction, a new dark point in the seemingly solid edifice of traditional religion. He did not yet know it, but he was building, without realizing it, the philosophical method that years later would be called biblical criticism, a method that would make him, in the judgment of modern historians, the first great skeptical biblical scholar in Western history. But let us return to the episode that is the very heart of this story, the episode of that winter day when young Baruch, then 22 years old, was walking alone down a side alley in Amsterdam and passed in front of a small clandestine Catholic chapel. Because you need to understand, my dear viewer, that the Calvinist Holland of that time did not officially allow Catholic worship. Catholics were tolerated, but in secret. They gathered in hidden chapels known as schuilkerken, or hidden churches, built inside seemingly normal houses, without bells, without towers, without outward signs of religion. It was necessary to know someone, have a password, go through a back door, to enter one of these secret chapels. And little Baruch, walking that cold afternoon, heard through an open window the unmistakable sound of a small bell, the bell that in the Catholic liturgy announces the exact moment of consecration, the moment when the priest, according to doctrine, transforms the bread into the body of Christ. He stopped, hesitated, looked to both sides of the street, and then, driven by a curiosity that he himself, years later, would describe as a force older than my own will, he approached the window. He stepped up onto a small stone step. and peered through the fogged glass at the scene that would forever change the course of his life. Inside that small room, dimly lit by tallow candles, about 30 people were kneeling. Men in dark cloaks, women in white bonnets, 2 or 3 children standing like statues with wide-open eyes. And before those people, an elderly priest wearing a worn golden chasuble raised, with trembling hands, a small white disk of baked dough. His eyes were closed. His lips moved in Latin, and then, in a murmur that Baruch could barely hear, the old man pronounced the sacred words, "Hoc est enim corpus meum." This is, in fact, my body. The young philosopher stood still. The 30 faithful bowed down to the ground. The small bell tinkled a second time. And one by one, those men, women, and children approached the altar, opened their mouths and swallowed the bread. They swallowed what they believed with absolute certainty to be the physical, real, concrete body of the infinite God who created the universe. Baruch stepped down from the step, turned around, started walking back home, and inside his head a single phrase echoed like a bell that no human hand could ever silence. How is it possible that the infinite fits in the finite? How is it possible? How is it possible? How is it possible? He walked for kilometers without realizing it, passed by his own house and kept walking, crossed bridges, canals, squares, and when he finally stopped, it was already night, and he found himself before the icy sea of the Amsterdam port, looking at the black masts of the ships of the East India Company, gently swaying in the dark water. It was there, that night, with frozen feet and a heart on fire, that the philosopher who would change the world was born within him. 3 days after that vision at the window of the clandestine chapel, young Baruch knocked on the door of Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, the greatest scholar of the Jewish community in Amsterdam, the man who corresponded with English philosophers, with Queen Christina of Sweden, with Rembrandt van Rijn, who lived just down the same street, and who, a few years earlier, had painted the portrait of the rabbi himself, now hanging in the greatest museums in the world. Manasseh was a man with long beards and tired eyes, but with an intelligence sharp as a Turkish blade, and he had for young Baruch a special, almost paternal affection, because he recognized in that boy a mind that emerges once every 100 years, at most. Baruch entered the rabbi's library, a small room with walls lined with books from floor to ceiling, where the smell of old leather, ink, and beeswax candles created an almost sacred atmosphere. He sat in the wooden chair in front of the desk, and, without further ado, he fired the question that had been consuming his sleep for 72 hours. "Master, explain something to me. If God is infinite, as our own books repeatedly affirm, and if the infinite cannot, by definition, be contained within something finite, because it would contradict its own infinite nature, how is it possible that millions of Christians believe every Sunday that God is concretely contained within a piece of bread?" The rabbi looked at him in silence for a long minute. Then he smiled and said, "My son, this is not a question about Christians. This is a question about God. And I warn you, right away, that questions about God asked with this level of logical rigor, instead of being asked with the humble heart of faith, are questions that tend to devour those who ask them. Are you sure you want to continue down this path?" Baruch replied without hesitation, with a single word, "I am." And it was at that moment, my dear viewer, that the first crack opened between the disciple and the master. A fine crack, almost invisible, like the cracks that appear in the walls of a house before a devastating earthquake. Neither of them knew yet, but that conversation was the prelude to the greatest religious fracture in the history of the Dutch Jewish community. The rabbi tried patiently to respond. He said that Christians distinguish between substance and accident, and that the doctrine of transubstantiation, officially formulated by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, states that the substance of the bread is converted into the substance of the body of Christ, while the accidents, that is, the color, taste, texture, shape of the bread, remain unchanged. That is why, Manasseh explained, they can say that the bread is, in fact, the body of Christ, even though it still appears to the eye and taste as ordinary bread. Young Baruch listened in silence, and when the rabbi finished, he replied with a calm and devastating voice, "Master, but if the substance of the bread has been replaced by the substance of Christ, and if the accidents, that is, everything we can perceive through the senses, remain as the accidents of the bread, then we are faced with something very strange. A substance without its own accidents and accidents without their own substance. This, in the Aristotelian logic that the Christians themselves adopt, is a metaphysical impossibility. It is like saying that there is size without there being any object that has that size. It is like saying that there is the color red floating in the air without there being any red object. The very philosophical principles on which the doctrine relies destroy the doctrine." The rabbi fell silent, and in that silence, my friend, was contained all the tragedy that would befall young Spinoza in the following years. Now, my dear viewer, before I continue with the story, let me take a small pause here, because I know, I feel, I sense that you are listening to this with a different attention than you usually have when watching other videos. I know because the questions that Spinoza asked in that dusty library in Amsterdam are questions that, deep down, we have all asked. At some point in life, perhaps in childhood when we asked the priest why God needed money, perhaps in youth when we looked at a procession full of gold and wondered if that was really humility, perhaps in maturity when we saw a televangelist asking for donations from poor retirees to buy a private jet in the name of Christ. These questions are within you. I know they are, and that is why I want to ask you for a small favor, but one that means a lot to me. Write in the comments now at this very moment a single sentence. Just one. The answer to this question. What was the first moment in your life when you doubted a religious ritual that everyone around you seemed to find normal? It doesn't have to be long. It can be a childhood memory. It can be a scene in church. It can be a thought you had in silence and never told anyone. Write it down below. I read all the comments, and I guarantee you will be surprised by the number of people on the other side of the screen who lived exactly the same thing as you, in the same silence, thinking they were the only ones in the world. And since you are here, since you have reached this point in the video, since your mind is open enough to consider questions that most people prefer not to ask, I want to invite you to something greater. Subscribe to the channel. Hit that little bell down there, turn on notifications, and join this brotherhood of seekers who every week gather here to discuss the great philosophers who have been silenced by official history. Because this story of Spinoza is just the beginning. After him we have Giordano Bruno burned alive in Rome, we have Miguel Servet burned in Geneva, we have Galileo forced to kneel before the Inquisition, we have Nietzsche going mad in Turin in 1889. We have so many stories that need to be told, so many voices that need to be heard again, and none of this is possible without you, on the other side of the screen, pressing that simple subscribe button and being part of this community. Do it now while you think of the words of Rabbi Manasseh, silently looking at young Baruch, because the silence of that rabbi, my friend, was the same silence that official history tried to impose on all these voices. And only together, only by pressing the button, only by writing in the comments, only by sharing the video, can we break this silence, one voice at a time. All right, now let's return to Manasseh's library. The rabbi, after that long silence, stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the canal below where a barge loaded with barrels of beer was slowly passing, and said without turning around, "Baruch, my son, I will tell you something, and I want you to keep this thing deep in your heart, because one day it will either save your life or destroy your life, depending on how you decide to use it. Religions, all of them, ours included, are not constructions of reason. They are constructions of fear, the fear of death, the fear of chaos, the fear of emptiness. And to placate this fear, human beings invented rituals, gestures, words, formulas. Rituals do not need to be logically coherent. They just need to work. They just need to console. They just need to give the feeling that there is an order, a meaning, a divine presence in a universe that, without rituals, would seem an unbearable abyss of indifference. If you start to analyze rituals with pure logic, as you are doing now with the Christian Eucharist, you will discover that all of them, all without exception, including ours, fall apart into contradictions. All, And when you discover this, my son, you will have two options. Either you shut your mouth, accept that rituals are necessary for fragile human psychology and live in peace, or you shout the truth and pay the price of absolute solitude. I cannot choose for you, but I can warn you. Baruch listened in silence. He stood up, thanked, left the library, descended the narrow stairs, and when he reached the street with his eyes burning but without tears, he murmured to himself a single phrase, almost inaudible, which a neighbor heard and recorded decades later in a diary. I choose to shout. 2 years passed. 2 years of frantic readings, of notebooks filled with notes in Latin, Portuguese, and Hebrew, of secret conversations with young students who began to gather around Baruch like bees around a dangerously sweet flower. 2 years during which the young philosopher, without publishing a single line, without giving a single public lecture, without making a single sermon, had already become the most talked about and most forbidden subject of the Sephardic community in Amsterdam. The rabbis heard, from various sources, that the son of Spinoza was saying strange things in private meetings, that he claimed, for example, that the Bible was not literally the Word of God, but a historical document written by men in specific political contexts, and that it should be read with the same critical rigor as any other ancient document, that he claimed that the immortal soul did not exist as a separate entity from the body, but that the mind and body were two expressions of a single fundamental substance, that he claimed that God and nature were at their core the same thing, and that therefore all the apparatus of prayers, sacrifices, rituals, religious festivals was fundamentally a form of glorified superstition. The community went into a panic, and you need to understand, my dear viewer, why. Because the Jewish community of Amsterdam, at that historical moment, was walking on a tightrope stretched over an abyss. Calvinist Holland tolerated them, yes, but with conditions. The main one was, control your own. If a Jew began to publish atheistic ideas, or to attack the Christian religion, or to sow doubts about the existence of God, the entire community would be held responsible. Tolerance could be revoked, privileges could be withdrawn, and the Jews, who had suffered so much to get there, could be expelled again to the roads of the diaspora. Therefore, when the rabbis realized that the young Baruch Spinoza was becoming a focal point of intellectual heresy, capable of contaminating dozens, perhaps hundreds of other young people, they decided to act, and to act violently. They first tried the route of bribery. They called him to the synagogue and offered him an annual pension of 1,000 florins, a fortune for any young scholar, on the condition that he remain silent. He just had to not publish, not teach, not contest in public. He could think whatever he wanted in private, as long as the words did not leave his mouth. Baruch refused, politely but firmly. He said that the truth, if it is truth, demands to be spoken, and that no amount of money in the world could buy the silence of a mind that discovered a fundamental contradiction in the edifice of organized religion. They then tried the route of intimidation. Old friends stopped greeting him on the street. Relatives began to cross to the other side when they saw him approaching. One day, leaving the theater, a stranger dressed in a black cloak stabbed him in the chest. Baruch, by miracle, dodged in time, and the blade merely tore his coat without hitting flesh. Years later, he would have that torn coat framed and hung on the wall of his small room in The Hague as a permanent reminder that ideas, when they are truly dangerous, awaken in men the will to kill. And finally, when neither bribery nor the dagger had worked, the rabbis decided to use the most terrible weapon in the Jewish arsenal, the cherem. Excommunication, total banishment from the community. And not just any cherem, one of those light cherems that lasted a few days and could be lifted with an apology, but the maximum cherem, the eternal cherem. The cherem that made the excommunicated person, for all practical purposes, a living dead. A ghost walking the streets, invisible to the community, forbidden any contact, forever separated from friends, family, and their own people. On the morning of July 27th, 1656, a Saturday, the great Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam was packed. Everyone knew that something serious was about to happen. The news had spread during the week, in whispers, at taverns, in discreet notes, in corner meetings. Baruch himself was out of town, staying at a Gentile friend's house, knowing that if he showed up at the synagogue he would be publicly humiliated, or worse still, perhaps lynched by the furious crowd. But even without him present, the ritual had to be carried out, according to the ancient formulas inherited from medieval Spain, with all the ceremonial weight that tradition demanded. The elder of the synagogue, a man named Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera, ascended to the pulpit. The faithful fell silent. A kind of chill ran through the hall, although it was midsummer. And then, with a voice that 30 witnesses later described as a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth and not from the mouth of a man, the rabbi began to read the decree of excommunication. The text, which has survived to this day in the community's archives, is of such blunt violence that even today, when read aloud, it sends chills down the spine of those who hear it. By the judgment of the angels and by the sentence of the saints, the rabbi proclaimed, "We excommunicate, expel, execrate, and curse Baruch Spinoza. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises. Cursed when he goes out, and cursed when he comes in. May the Lord never forgive him. May the wrath and indignation of the Lord be kindled against this man, and may all the curses written in the book of the law fall upon him, and may the Lord blot out his name from under heaven. And we warn everyone that no one should speak to him, neither by mouth nor in writing, nor show him any kindness, nor stay under the same roof as him, nor approach him within 4 cubits, nor read any paper composed or written by him." When the rabbi finished, a shofar was blown, the ritual trumpet made from a ram's horn. The black candles that had been lit before the ritual were extinguished, one by one turned upside down, and buried in sand, symbolizing that the soul of the excommunicated was, from that moment on, considered dead to the people of Israel. The entire community repeated in unison, "Amen." And Baruch Spinoza, at the age of 23, ceased to exist, officially, as a member of the Jewish people. But, my dear viewer, here is the most surprising part of this story. When a messenger, days later, managed to find Baruch at the friend's house where he was hiding and read to him in a trembling voice the full text of the excommunication, with all the curses, with all the prohibitions, with all the weight of that sentence that would have psychologically destroyed any other man, Baruch simply smiled. A small, calm, almost sweet smile. And he said a phrase that historians consider, to this day, one of the most serene responses ever given to institutional violence. He said, "They force me to do what I had already decided to do on my own. They free me from a prison I no longer wanted to return to. So be it. Now I can finally think in peace." And that is exactly what he did. Before we continue following Spinoza's solitary path after the cherem, we need you and I, my dear viewer, to take a narrative pause and delve into a territory that the philosopher himself explored with astonishing depth in his secret manuscripts, a territory that the official history of the Church prefers that you, or any other faithful of any religion, never visit. Because if you visit, if you walk through these forgotten ruins of antiquity, if you read carefully the texts that archaeologists have unearthed in the last 2 centuries, you will discover one thing that will leave you breathless. The ritual of eating the body of a god, that seemingly Christian gesture, so exclusive to the Catholic Church, so central in the Sunday Mass, is in fact much, much older than Christianity, much older than Jesus himself. And it existed with impressive variations but essentially identical in at least a dozen earlier religions, spread throughout the Mediterranean basin, from Egypt to Persia, from Greece to North Africa. Let's start with the Egyptians. About 5,000 years ago, along the fertile banks of the Nile, the priests of the god Osiris celebrated a ritual that any Catholic, if teleported back in time, would immediately recognize. Osiris, according to the myth, had been killed by his brother Set, who cut the god's body into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout Egypt. The goddess Isis, Osiris's wife and sister, patiently gathered the pieces, reconstituted the divine body, and resurrected her murdered husband. Every year in spring, the priests celebrated the death and resurrection of Osiris with a ceremony in which breads made in the shape of the god's body were consecrated at the altar, broken by the chief priest and distributed to the faithful, who ate them believing that by doing so, they were literally incorporating the divine substance of Osiris into their bodies, thus guaranteeing eternal life for themselves. Read that sentence carefully and compare it with the Sunday Mass. The similarity is not just remarkable, it is absolutely disturbing. Let's go to Greece. About 3,000 years ago, the cults of Dionysus, the god of wine, celebrated an even more explicit ceremony. Dionysus, according to the myth, had been dismembered by the Titans who devoured his body. Zeus, horrified, saved the heart of the child god, and from it recreated Dionysus, who resurrected. The followers of Dionysus, known as Maenads, celebrated the god's resurgence with a ritual in which they drank consecrated wine, believing that the wine was literally the blood of Dionysus, and that by drinking it they became possessed by the divine spirit. In some more extreme variants of the cult, the Maenads would tear apart live animals and eat their raw flesh, believing that the flesh of that animal was, at that sacred moment, the flesh of the resurrected Dionysus himself. Bread as body, wine as blood, resurrection of a dead god, physical communion with the divinity through ingestion. 600 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Let's jump to Persia. Around 1500 BC, a religion called Mithraism emerged in the Iranian plateau, dedicated to the god Mithras, which would later spread throughout the Roman Empire, especially among the legionaries, becoming, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era, the main rival religion to emerging Christianity. Mithras, according to Persian mythology, had been born in a stable, visited by 3 magi, performed 12 miracles, had 12 disciples, died to save humanity, and resurrected on the 3rd day. You read that right. I am not describing Jesus. I am describing Mithras, a Persian god whose cult existed over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, and the followers of Mithras celebrated, in underground temples called Mithraea, a sacred ritual in which the priest consecrated bread and wine, saying that the bread was the flesh of Mithras and the wine was the blood of Mithras, and that all those who ate and drank of that divine substance would have eternal life. The early fathers of the Catholic Church, when they began to defend themselves against accusations of plagiarizing Mithraism, used an argument that now seems comical to us. They claimed that the devil, foreseeing the future, had inspired the Persians to create a ritual identical to the Christian one, centuries earlier, precisely to confuse the faithful. This is the official explanation that fathers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian wrote in their 2nd century treatises. The devil invented the Eucharist before Jesus to confuse us. Think of the theological acrobatics required to sustain such a claim. And finally, let's go to Greece again, but now to the so-called Eleusinian Mysteries, the oldest and most prestigious religious cult of the ancient world, which lasted approximately 2,000 years, from 1500 BC until the year 392 of the Christian era, when the Christian emperor Theodosius prohibited it and destroyed the sanctuary. In the Eleusinian Mysteries, the initiates, after a long purification process lasting days, participated in a sacred ceremony in which they consumed a drink called kykeon, made with fermented barley and apparently mixed with a hallucinogenic fungus, ergotamine, which induced mystical visions. Along with the kykeon, they ate sacred breads consecrated to the goddess Demeter, the goddess of grains. And after this sacred communion, the initiates emerged from the temple with the absolute certainty that they had conquered death, that their soul was immortal, that they were united with the divine substance of Demeter, and that the grave no longer frightened them. Consecrated bread, sacred drink, communion with the divine, promise of eternal life, millennia before Christianity. Spinoza studied all of this. Of course he did. In his secret notebooks, written in Latin to be read only by trusted friends, he noted, with the coldness of a scientist, all these similarities, all these repetitions, all these parallels. And the conclusion he reached, my dear viewer, is a conclusion that will cause you some discomfort, but that I need to deliver to you with absolute honesty, because it is the central conclusion of his philosophy on religion. The conclusion is this: the ritual of eating the body of a god is not a divine revelation. It is a human invention. an invention as old as civilization itself, an invention that was born in agricultural societies where humans, seeing the grain being planted, dying in the soil, rising as an ear, being harvested, ground, transformed into bread, eaten, digested, and then through excrement returning to the earth to generate new grains, created a fundamental metaphor about death and resurrection. The grain is the God. The God dies so that the bread exists. The bread is eaten, and the God rises within human beings. And from the bodies of human beings, the God returns to the earth to be reborn in the next harvest. This is the agricultural metaphor that underlies all these ancient religions. And it is this same metaphor, my friend, that Christianity inherited, absorbed, redefined, and transformed into the central ritual of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. This does not make religion false. Spinoza would be the first to say that this does not make religion false. What makes religion interesting, in his opinion, is precisely the fact that it embodies deep psychological truths about humanity. But this makes it absolutely impossible, from a historical and rational point of view, to sustain that the ritual of the Christian Eucharist is an exclusive revelation from God to Christians. It is, in reality, the most recent variation of a ritual theme that humanity has been repeating, with small variations, for at least 5,000 years. And if that is the case, if the gesture is so old, so widespread, so recurrent in cultures that have never had contact with each other, then the question that Spinoza asked in that Amsterdam library in 1654 takes on a much deeper dimension. Why, after all, do we as a species need so much to symbolically eat our God? What does this need say about us? For you to understand, my dear viewer, how that ancient gesture, inherited from the Egyptians, Greeks, Persians, and the cults of Eleusis, was definitively transformed within Christianity into the official doctrine of transubstantiation that would dominate Europe for over 800 years, we now need to leave Amsterdam and travel in time and space to an Italian city called Trent, located at the foot of the Alps, where between the years 1545 and 1563, the council that most influenced the modern form of the Catholic Church convened, the famous Council of Trent. It was there, my friend, that the doctrine about the Eucharistic bread, which had existed for centuries in embryonic form, was codified, hardened, dogmatized, and transformed into absolute law, with the penalty of immediate excommunication for any faithful who dared to disagree with a single comma of the text. The context is important. In 1517, 30 years before the council began, a German Augustinian monk named Martin Luther had nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door of the church of the castle of Wittenberg, initiating what history would call the Protestant Reformation. Luther, and after him, Calvin, Zwingli, and so many other reformers, contested various aspects of Catholic doctrine. But one of the most attacked points was precisely the doctrine of transubstantiation. The Protestants argued, based on a direct reading of the Gospels, that when Jesus said, "This is my body," during the Last Supper, he was speaking symbolically, as he had so many times before, using metaphors. Just as Jesus said, "I am the vine," without anyone imagining that he was literally a climbing plant, or "I am the bread of life." Without anyone imagining that he was literally a slice of bread, also when he said, "This is my body," according to the Reformers, he was using an image, a powerful metaphor, but not a literal statement. The response of the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent was harsh. During the 13th session of the Council, in October 1551, the bishops gathered, issued a solemn decree that established, with absolute legal precision, the official doctrine of the Church on the Eucharist. And here, my dear viewer, is where things get really interesting, because the text of the decree explicitly reveals the level of authority that the conciliar fathers arrogated to themselves. They were not simply interpreting a mystery. They were defining, by vote, by decree, by collective signature, what millions of people should believe about the physical nature of the consecrated bread. A piece of baked dough was elevated, through a vote in an ecclesiastical assembly, to the category of the physical and real body of the Creator of the universe. And anyone who refused to accept this statement would be, literally, anathema. That is, cursed, excommunicated, separated from the body of the Church, and, in previous centuries, burned alive by the Inquisition. The Tridentine decree used a formula that would become famous in the following centuries, the formula of si quis dixerit, anathema sit, in Portuguese. If anyone says, let him be anathema. And then came a list of statements that no one could make under penalty of excommunication. If anyone says that in the Eucharist there is only the figure or sign of the body of Christ, let him be anathema. If anyone says that the bread and wine continue to exist together with the body and blood of Christ, let him be anathema. If anyone says that after the consecration, the bread and wine are not truly, really, and substantially converted into the body and blood of Christ, let him be anathema. Read these sentences again. Pay attention to the legal language. Pay attention to the imperative tone. Pay attention to the fact that a group of men, all mortal, all fallible, all with political and economic interests to defend, were decreeing, by majority vote, what the physical substance of reality should be. And here, my dear listener, we arrive at the heart of Spinoza's critique. Because what Spinoza saw, with that uncomfortable lucidity that only great philosophers possess, was the following. The doctrine of transubstantiation is not, in its essence, a religious doctrine. It is a political doctrine. It is an instrument of social control. It is a brilliantly, diabolically brilliant way to concentrate spiritual power in the hands of a specific caste of men, the priests, who are the only ones authorized to perform the magical transformation of bread into God. Without the priest, there is no Eucharist. Without the Eucharist, there is no salvation. Without salvation, there is eternal hell. Therefore, without the priest, there is hell. This is the implicit logical chain. And this logical chain transforms the priest, any priest, even the most ignorant, even the most corrupt, even the most immoral, into an absolute monopolist of access to eternal salvation. Think carefully, with me, about the consequences of this. If you are a French peasant in the 16th century, you cannot read. You work 15 hours a day on a piece of land that is not yours. You have children who die of hunger. You fear hell. And there is only one person in your village who can, through a sacred gesture, transform a piece of bread into the body of God and thus open the doors of paradise for you. That person is the priest. Whoever controls the priest controls you. Whoever pays the priest's salary controls you. Whoever teaches the priest what he should preach controls you. Whoever places or removes priests from parishes controls you. And whoever controls all this is the ecclesiastical hierarchy, which in turn answers to the Pope in Rome. You, poor peasant, are completely at the mercy of a power system whose decisions are made thousands of kilometers away, in a language you do not understand, by men you have never seen, who collectively decide what you can or cannot believe to save your soul. Spinoza perceived this with painful clarity, and he noted, in his notebooks, an observation that is perhaps the most subversive phrase he wrote in all his work. The phrase was this: the greatest miracle performed by the Church is not to transform bread into God, it is to transform the infinite God into a hostage of the Church. Read it again. Pay attention to every word. The greatest miracle is not the bread becoming God. The greatest miracle is the infinite God becoming a prisoner of the institution that claims to distribute him. Because once it is established that God can only be accessed through the Eucharist, and that the Eucharist can only be produced by priests, and that priests can only be ordained by the ecclesiastical hierarchy, then God, the infinite eternal God, creator of the universe, is, in practice, locked inside cathedrals, tied to altars, and distributed in small doses only to those who submit to the system. And whoever has the key to the vault where God is kept, my dear viewer, has evidently a political power that no king, no emperor, no general in all of human history has ever had. That is why, my friend, Spinoza's questions were so dangerous, not because they attacked God. Attacking God is relatively harmless from the point of view of power. Militant atheists, as has been proven throughout the ages, rarely generate movements capable of shaking institutions. What shakes institutions is something different. It is when someone like Spinoza says, "I am not attacking God. On the contrary, I love God more than you do." I defend a God so great, so infinite, so present in all things, that he does not need you to be accessed. He is in the stone, in the tree, in the wind, in my own thought. I do not need your Eucharist to commune with him. I already commune with him with every breath. When someone says this, my dear viewer, someone who says this with the intellectual authority and philosophical coherence of Spinoza, that person is not just being a heretic. They are, in practice, breaking the monopoly. They are declaring bankruptcy to the oldest, richest, most powerful enterprise in Western civilization. And it is clear, absolutely clear, that this enterprise will react with all the ferocity it is capable of. After the excommunication of 1656, Spinoza moved to a small village called Rijnsburg, about 40 kilometers from Amsterdam, near the university city of Leiden. He rented a simple room in the house of a doctor named Hermann Homan, who sympathized with the Collegiant sect, a group of radical Christians who rejected both Catholicism and official Calvinism, and who gathered in small communities to discuss the Bible freely, without pastors, without dogmas, without hierarchy. It was among these heterodox Christians, strangely, that Spinoza, the excommunicated Jew, found his first faithful disciples. And it was in that small room with a small window facing a simple garden that he began to write the book that would be considered, by historians of philosophy, the most daring metaphysical treatise of all time, The Ethics, demonstrated in the manner of geometers. The title already reveals its revolution. Ethics, because the ultimate goal of the book was to teach human beings how to live well, how to achieve true happiness, how to find mental peace, but demonstrated in the manner of geometers, that is, written in the format of Euclid's geometry books, with definitions, axioms, propositions, and rigorous mathematical demonstrations, as if it were a treatise on triangles and circles, and not on God, on the human being, on love, on freedom. This choice of form, my dear viewer, was not accidental. Spinoza wanted to prove that philosophy, when done with the rigor of a mathematician, can reach conclusions as solid about God and the human soul as the conclusions Euclid had reached about geometric figures 2,000 years earlier. He wanted to prove that the truth about the deepest spiritual questions does not depend on revelation, prophecy, miracles, or sacred texts, but can be reached by human reason when that reason is applied with absolute discipline. And what did human reason, applied with this geometric rigor, reveal to Spinoza about God? Here, my friend, I need you to be seated, literally, because the answer that Spinoza found will dismantle in a few lines the way 2,000 years of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic theology have constructed the image of God in the Western mind. And it will offer, in its place, a vision so broad, so radical, so liberating, that even today, 400 years later, it still seems revolutionary to those who hear it for the first time. Spinoza begins the book with a definition that seems simple, but is, in fact, a philosophical bomb. He says, "By substance, I understand that which is in itself and is conceived by itself." Read this sentence slowly. That which is in itself and is conceived by itself. That is, substance, in the rigorous philosophical sense, is that which does not depend on anything else to exist, and which can be understood without reference to anything else. Now Spinoza asks, how many things exist in the universe that satisfy this definition? How many things exist that do not depend on absolutely anything else to exist, and that can be understood without reference to anything else? And the answer, after a long geometric demonstration, is 1. There is only one substance in the entire universe, one single infinite, eternal, self-sufficient substance that contains within itself all existing reality. And this unique substance, this unique reality, this unique being, Spinoza calls God, or using a phrase that became famous, God or nature. God sive natura. The two names for Spinoza refer to the same thing. Did you notice what just happened? Spinoza eliminated, with a single philosophical stroke, the separation between God and the world, which is the foundation of all traditional theology. For Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God is one thing, and the world is another thing. God created the world out of nothing. God is outside the world. God transcends the world. God can intervene in the world through miracles. God can reveal himself to the world through prophets. But God and the world are fundamentally two distinct realities. For Spinoza, no. For Spinoza, God and reality are the same thing. Everything that exists exists in God. Everything that happens happens in God. Every tree, every star, every heartbeat of yours, every thought you have had in your entire life, every emotion you have felt, all of this is an expression, a finite mode, a temporary modulation of the infinite substance that is God. There is no separate God who created the universe. The universe is God expressing himself in infinite forms. You, I, the chair you are sitting on, the sun that illuminates the planet, the most distant galaxies, time, space, matter, thought, all of this is God. One single substance, infinite expressions. And now, my dear viewer, can you understand why the religious authorities of Europe went into a panic when the first copies of the Ethics began to circulate clandestinely? Can you understand why the Ethics was published only after Spinoza's death in 1677, and even then immediately banned in all European countries without exception? Can you understand why Pope Innocent V personally ordered in Rome that all copies of the book be seized and burned? Because if Spinoza is right, if God and nature are the same thing, if God is in everything, in every person, in every leaf of a tree, then the entire structure of the Catholic Church, the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy, all the claims to be the exclusive intermediary between human beings and the divine, simply collapses. If God is everywhere, I do not need to go to church to find him. If God is in everything, I do not need a consecrated host to commune with him. If God is the very substance of the real, I am already permanently in communion with him, with every breath, every thought, every gesture. The Church, in one fell swoop, loses its reason for being. And the Eucharist. What happens to the Eucharist in Spinoza's system? Here lies the terrible beauty of his philosophy. Spinoza never said that the Eucharist is absurd in the vulgar sense. He said something much more subtle, much more devastating. He said, the Eucharist is right in recognizing that God is present in matter. It is right in asserting that, by eating that bread, you are ingesting a portion of the divine substance. Up to that point, I agree, he would say. The problem, the big problem, the fatal problem, is that the Eucharist asserts that God is in that specific bread, consecrated by that specific priest, in a greater or different quantity than in any other thing. And that, my friend, is an absurd reduction of the infinite. It is to say that the entire ocean fits in a cup of coffee. It is to say that the sunlight is concentrated in a single candle. God is indeed in that bread, but he is equally in the air you breathe while eating it. He is equally in the stone that decorates the altar. He is equally in the rat that runs through the cathedral's basements. He is equally in the dirty hand of the beggar asking for alms at the church door. He is in everything, everywhere, in infinite proportion. And to assert the opposite, to assert that God is more in that bread than in anything else, is to commit, according to Spinoza, the greatest of idolatries. To confuse a small part of God with the totality of God. It is to imprison the ocean in a cup and then worship the cup. Now that you understand, my dear viewer, the philosophical dimension of Spinoza's critique, we need to descend from the abstract to the concrete. We need to look, with the cold eyes of an accountant, at the economic and political dimension of the Eucharist ritual throughout history. Because one of the things Spinoza repeated in his letters exchanged with close friends is that no religious doctrine can survive through the centuries and dominate entire civilizations if there is not, behind it, a material structure, an economic machinery, a system of concrete interests that keeps the doctrine functioning. And in the case of the Eucharist, my friend, the material machinery that formed over the centuries is so gigantic, so complex, so fabulously rich, that even the most skeptical historians are impressed when they dive into the accounting archives of the Vatican and the great European dioceses. Let's start with the most obvious: gold. During the Middle Ages and the early modern age, any object that came into direct contact with the consecrated host, or that was used in the celebration of the Eucharist, had to, by ecclesiastical decree, be made of gold or gold-plated. The chalice which contained the wine transformed into blood had to be made of solid gold. The paten, the small plate where the host was placed, had to be made of gold. The tabernacle, the cabinet where the consecrated hosts were kept outside of mass hours, was lined with gold on the inside. The monstrance, that magnificent piece, usually in the shape of a radiant sun, used to display the host in processions, was made of gold encrusted with precious stones. The processional crosses, the sacrariums, the crowns of the images of saints, the reliquaries, everything, absolutely everything in gold. And we are not talking about small quantities. We are talking about tons and tons of gold accumulated over the centuries in every cathedral in Europe. Where did this gold come from? The answer, my dear viewer, is an answer that the Church prefers you not to know. It came from the faithful. It came from the illiterate peasant who worked the land from dawn to dusk and delivered a considerable portion of their production to the local parish as a mandatory tithe. It came from souls tormented by the fear of hell, who bought indulgences to reduce the purgatory time of their deceased relatives, and whose money was, in part, converted into gold liturgical objects. It came from the Americas, starting in 1492, when Spanish and Portuguese conquerors, with the explicit blessing of the Pope, plundered the temples of the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans, melted the sacred gold pieces of those civilizations, and reconverted them back into sacred objects of Christian liturgy. The gold that came out of the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia, carried by indigenous hands under conditions akin to slavery, crossed the Atlantic in Spanish galleons, and a considerable portion of it ended up, after many transformations, adorning the chalices in which, every Sunday, European priests claimed to be consecrating the blood of Christ. There is a historical irony so thick in this trajectory that Spinoza, in one of his letters, described the process in a single ruthless sentence. The idolaters were killed and plundered, so that the objects of their idolatry could be melted down and repurposed by the victorious idolatry. But gold is just the most visible layer of the system. Below the gold there was another layer, even more lucrative, that of paid masses. Since the Middle Ages, a theology developed in the Catholic Church, according to which each Mass celebrated had a specific spiritual value, and this value could be applied as if it were a bank transfer to a specific soul, living or dead. If your father had died, and you feared that he was suffering in the flames of purgatory, you could go to the priest, pay a certain amount of money, and order a Mass in intention for your father's soul. The priest would celebrate that Mass, pronounce the names during the consecration, and the spiritual value of that Eucharist would be applied, according to doctrine, to the suffering of the paternal soul, reducing its time of purification. The more Masses you paid for, the more quickly your father would be freed. The wealthier you were, the more quickly your entire family could go to paradise. The poorer you were, the longer your dead would suffer. This simple and terrifying logic generated over the centuries one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history. Medieval and modern wills often contained clauses in which the deceased allocated significant portions of their fortune for the payment of perpetual masses, that is, masses that would be celebrated eternally every year on the anniversary of their death, in intention for their soul. Entire monasteries were founded with the sole purpose of celebrating these perpetual masses in honor of the great deceased donors. Entire cathedrals were built with resources from this economy of paid masses, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy, my dear viewer, grew rich, expanded, consolidated, thanks to this constant flow of money that came from the fear of hell and the hope of heaven. Spinoza, in his notebooks, noted a phrase that still discomforts Catholic theologians. The Church discovered a way to charge tolls on the road to paradise, and since all human beings want to reach paradise, everyone pays. And there was still a third layer, perhaps the most sophisticated of all, the political layer, because the power to transform bread into God, which only the priests possessed, gave the Church an instrument of control over kings, princes, and emperors that no other human institution ever possessed. Throughout the Middle Ages, the worst sanction that the Church could apply to a rebellious ruler was the interdict. The interdict consisted of prohibiting the celebration of all masses, of all sacraments, throughout the territory of the rebellious ruler. Babies could not be baptized, The dying could not receive the last rites. Marriages could not be celebrated. The dead could not be buried in sacred ground. And above all, the Eucharist could not be consecrated. This meant, for the masses, that souls were delivered to hell, that babies died in a state of original sin, that couples lived in mortal sin, that the dead were condemned to eternal damnation, and the blame for all this fell on the ruler who had dared to challenge the Pope. The result? The subjects revolted, the rulers knelt, and the balance of power was always restored in favor of Rome. The most famous case of interdict in history is that of King Henry IV of Germany in the year 1077, when he was forced to walk barefoot in the snow for 3 days in front of the castle of Canossa, where Pope Gregory VII was staying, begging for forgiveness for his disobedience. 3 days barefoot in the snow, an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, humbling himself before the Bishop of Rome. And all this, my dear viewer, because of what? Because of the power that the Church had to interrupt the production of the Eucharist, because of the monopoly over the consecrated bread, because of the exclusivity in access to the God food that the doctrine had established as the only path to salvation. When Spinoza looked at this history, my dear viewer, and when he noted in his notebooks the episodes I have just described, he did not see just events of the past. He saw a pattern. He saw a machine. He saw a mechanism carefully adjusted over the centuries to concentrate in the hands of a small priestly elite a quantity of spiritual, political, and economic power that no king, no general, no banker had ever dreamed of having. And he realized that the key to this entire machine, the small critical gear without which the entire system would collapse, was precisely the ritual of the Eucharist, the belief that a piece of bread, consecrated by a specific man, wearing a specific garment, pronouncing specific words in Latin, transformed into the very body of God. Remove this belief, Spinoza argued, and the machine stops working. The priests cease to be indispensable. The hierarchy loses its justification. The tithe loses its meaning. Paid masses cease to be sold. The gold of the cathedrals becomes empty ornamentation. The interdicts no longer scare anyone, and human beings, finally freed from a millennial fear, can begin to seek God where God truly is, in themselves, in nature, in reason, in love, in the life that pulses at every moment in every corner of the universe. You may be wondering now, my dear viewer, why, if Spinoza's ideas were so powerful, so corrosive to the system, so capable of awakening humans from their ritualistic slumber, why they did not provoke an immediate revolution in the 17th century. Why did Europe continue, for centuries after him, repeating the same gestures, kneeling at the same altars, swallowing the same hosts, believing in the same doctrines? The answer, my friend, is a sad one, but deeply instructive, and it says a lot about human nature and how dangerous ideas are neutralized by institutions of power. The answer has a name: fear. The fear that the bonfires had taught Europe during 4 uninterrupted centuries of inquisitorial terror. When Spinoza began to write the Ethics in Rheinsberg around 1661, he had before his eyes the recent example, still fresh in memory, of an Italian philosopher named Giordano Bruno. Bruno had defended, 70 years earlier, ideas very similar to those of Spinoza, although less rigorously demonstrated. He argued that the universe was infinite, that there were infinite inhabited worlds, that God was present in all things, that the human soul was part of a universal soul, and that the rituals of the Church were, at their core, organized superstitions. Because of these ideas, Bruno was arrested by the Venetian Inquisition in 1592, handed over to the Roman Inquisition, tortured for 7 years in the Vatican prisons, sentenced to death in 1600, and burned alive in the Campo dei Fiori Square in Rome on February 17th of that year. According to the records of the execution, before being tied to the stake, the inquisitors pierced his tongue with a sharp iron to prevent him, while burning, from shouting any last phrase that might impress the crowd. He died in forced silence, swallowing his own words as the flames consumed his body. This was the concrete, visible, recent example that every European philosopher of the 17th century had before their eyes, and it was not the only one. Spinoza also knew the case of Miguel Servet, the Spanish physician burned in Geneva in 1553, by order of Calvin himself, for questioning the doctrine of the Trinity. He knew the case of Lucilio Vanini, the Italian philosopher burned in Toulouse in 1619, for arguing that the soul was material, and that miracles were misunderstood natural phenomena. He knew the case of Tommaso Campanella, who spent 27 years in the prisons of the Neapolitan Inquisition. He knew the case of Galileo Galilei, who in 1633, just a year after Spinoza's birth, had been forced to kneel before the Inquisition court and publicly abjure, in front of the cardinals, his assertion that the earth revolved around the sun. Galileo, one of the greatest scientists in history, publicly humiliated, sentenced to perpetual house arrest, with all his books placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of books whose reading was forbidden to all Catholics under penalty of excommunication. In light of this scenario, Spinoza made a choice that historians of philosophy still debate today, trying to understand whether it was cowardice or wisdom. He decided not to publish the Ethics while he was alive. He decided to write the book in Latin, the scholarly language, which only an intellectual elite could read. He decided to circulate the manuscript only among friends of absolute trust, a small circle of like-minded individuals in Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam, Leiden, and also in some German and French cities through coded correspondence. And he decided to live in an absolutely modest way, polishing lenses for glasses and microscopes in a small rented room, refusing all offers of university chairs that were made to him, including one from the prestigious University of Heidelberg, because accepting them would mean having to submit his ideas to official censorship. When a friend once asked him why he did not publish the Ethics immediately, since the world needed those ideas so much, Spinoza replied with a phrase that became famous in philosophical circles of the time, a phrase that reveals everything about his intellectual strategy. He said, "True ideas are not in a hurry. They have centuries at their disposal. A book published prematurely and burned by the Inquisition is a book silenced for generations. A book patiently kept, protected from inquisitors, discreetly distributed to the best readers, is a book that gradually infiltrates the consciousness of humanity, and that, at a certain historical moment, when political conditions allow, emerges with all its accumulated strength. I prefer to be read by 10 readers in each century, for 10 centuries, than to be read by 10,000 readers in just 1 year before being burned forever." This phrase, my dear viewer, is one that demands reflection, because it reveals a profound understanding of the nature of power and the nature of ideas. Spinoza understood that institutions of power, when directly threatened by a radical idea, respond with immediate violence and often manage to eliminate both the idea and the thinker. But when the same idea infiltrates slowly, through handwritten copies circulating in secret, through private conversations in salons of enlightened nobles, through coded correspondence between philosophers, through indirect references in seemingly innocuous books, the idea occupies space, generates disciples, transforms minds, and when it finally emerges, decades or centuries later, it has become so widespread that the institutions of power can no longer extinguish it without entering into open warfare with a significant part of society itself. That is exactly what happened with Spinoza's ideas, my friend. He died in 1677 at the age of 44 from a pulmonary disease likely caused by years of inhaling glass dust during his work as a lens polisher. He died in the small room he rented in The Hague, in the home of a simple family, the Van der Spijks, who treated him with an almost familial affection. In his room on the table was the completed manuscript of the Ethics, wrapped in brown paper, with precise instructions for it to be sent, after his death, to a group of friends in Amsterdam, who would take care of the posthumous publication. The Ethics was published in November 1677, a few months after the author's death, in a small clandestine edition. In 1678 it was officially banned in the Netherlands. In 1679 it entered the Vatican's Index Librorum Prohibitorum. In 1690, King Louis XIV of France banned its circulation in all domains of the French kingdom. In German universities, anyone caught reading the book was expelled. In Italian universities, anyone caught reading the book was reported to the Inquisition. And yet, my dear viewer, the book continued to circulate, hand-copied, hidden in private libraries, secretly translated into Dutch, French, and German, discussed in letters, commented on in salons, summarized in clandestine pamphlets, and 70 years after Spinoza's death, when the philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment began to sweep across Europe, with names like Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, d'Alembert, Hume, Lessing, there were, in practically all the major authors, the ideas of Spinoza transformed, adapted, sometimes attributed to others, sometimes subtly recognized, but always present, always influential, always shaping the consciousness of modernity. Lessing, in 1780, shortly before his death, confessed to a friend that he had been, throughout his life, a secret Spinozist. Goethe, the greatest German poet, openly declared in his autobiography that reading the Ethics had been the most decisive intellectual experience of his youth. Einstein, in the 20th century, when asked which God he believed in, famously replied, "I believe in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the harmonious order of all that exists, and not in a God who concerns himself with the actions and destinies of human beings." Each of these statements, my dear listener, represents a small posthumous victory of that young Jew from Amsterdam who in 1656, at the age of 23, was cursed, banished, stoned, and silenced by his own community. But, and here lies the most important point of all, this posthumous victory was never complete. Spinoza's ideas changed philosophy, changed science, changed politics, changed art, changed the understanding that the West has of itself. But they could not change one thing. One single thing. Next Sunday, my dear viewer, in tens of thousands of cathedrals spread across all continents, billions of people will kneel before an altar, will see a robed man raise a small white disk of dough, will hear the Latin words that transform, according to doctrine, that bread into the physical body of the Creator of the universe, and will, in reverent silence, open their mouths to swallow. And Spinoza, 400 years later, remains just a shadow in the books of philosophy, a name that many have heard, an idea that few know, a warning that almost no one hears. Why? Why, despite all the scientific revolution, all the critical philosophy, all the Enlightenment, all of modernity, does the ritual remain untouched? Why do we continue as a species to symbolically eat the body of God, without ever stopping to ask what we are really doing? The answer to this question, my friend, is complex, multifaceted, and involves deep layers of human psychology. The history of institutions, the economy of power, and the inertia of civilizations. My dear viewer, we need to make an incursion into the most subtle territory of all of Spinoza's philosophy, the territory of human psychology, because Spinoza, unlike most philosophers of his time, did not limit himself to analyzing abstract concepts about God and the soul. He delved with a depth that would only be matched centuries later by Sigmund Freud into the inner labyrinths of the human mind. And it was there, in the dark swamps of emotions, habits, involuntary associations, and childhood conditioning, that he found the true explanation for the survival of religious rituals over the millennia. The Ethics, in its third and fourth parts, is entirely dedicated to dissecting what Spinoza called human servitude, that is, the slavery to which we are subjected by our own passions. And among all the passions that enslave us, my friend, one stands out for its ability to shape us from cradle to grave. Habit. Habit is the invisible chain that binds the human mind to automatic repetitions. It is the silent force that makes us continue to perform gestures, to pronounce words, to believe in ideas, without ever stopping to question them. It is, according to Spinoza, the main ally of religious institutions, because it turns critical reason into a muscle atrophied by lack of use. Think with me. A Catholic child is taken to church for the first time at 2, 3, 4 years old. They still do not speak properly. They do not yet understand what God is, what a sacrament is, what salvation is, but they already participate. They kneel when their parents kneel. They make the sign of the cross, imitating the movements they see around them. They bring their hand to their mouth, pretending to receive a host at home when playing with dolls. This conditioning begins before reflective consciousness, before critical reason, before the ability to ask questions about the meaning of actions, and when, years later, at 10, 12, 15 years old, the child finally develops the intellectual capacity to ask, "Why am I doing this?" They have already performed those gestures so many times. They are so ingrained in bodily memory, in neural reflexes, in emotional associations with family, with parental affection, with the security of home, that any attempt to question them rationally seems immediately an emotional betrayal. Questioning the ritual is questioning childhood. Questioning the sacrament is questioning beloved grandparents, a cherished mother, the smell of incense that was the smell of Sunday morning. That is why, my dear viewer, religious institutions have always been so zealous in ensuring access to small children. First communion at 7, 8 years old, catechism at 9, 10, confirmation in adolescence. Each of these stages represents, from a psychological point of view, a new layer of conditioning, deposited upon the still-forming mind, solidifying the rituals in stone, making them increasingly impermeable to rational criticism. An adult who tries, at 40, to question the Eucharist will find that they are struggling not only with theological arguments, but with decades of memories, affections, sensory recollections, anticipatory guilt, primitive fear. They are not discussing a doctrine. They are discussing themselves, their own biography, their own soul, their own childhood. Spinoza perceived this with a clarity that is startling. In one of the most moving passages of the Ethics, he writes that men believe themselves to be free only because they are conscious of their actions, but they ignore the causes that determine them. Read that sentence slowly. Men believe they are free when choosing to kneel before the altar. They believe they are exercising their freedom when they commune. They believe they are making a conscious choice when they follow the Church's rules. But Spinoza, with an almost cruel coldness, points out what men prefer not to see. They did not choose any of this. They were chosen by it. They were shaped, conditioned, trained from the cradle to perform exactly these gestures and to interpret them in exactly this way. If they had been born into a Hindu family, they would be, with the same conviction, lighting incense before a statue of Ganesha. If they had been born into a Muslim family, they would be, with the same devotion, prostrating themselves towards Mecca 5 times a day. If they had been born into a Candomblé family, they would be, with the same faith, offering sacred foods to specific orixas. The religion that each person practices, in the vast majority of cases, is not the result of a free and rational choice made in maturity. It is the result of the place, the family, the time in which the person was born. And yet, each person believes, with absolute certainty, that their religion is the true one, while others are false, superstitious, or at best, imperfect. This realization, my dear listener, is one of the most devastating that Spinoza offers us, because it suggests that religious faith, in the way most people live it, is not a profound spiritual phenomenon, but a geographical phenomenon. It is not a response of the soul to the ultimate questions of existence, but an automatic response to the environment in which one was born. And if that is the case, if religions are primarily products of cultural contexts, then the theological disputes between them, the religious wars, the inquisitions, the bonfires, the excommunications, all of this reveals itself as an absurd theater in which billions of human beings kill and hate each other over differences that were imposed on them before they even had the age to reason. Spinoza, in his private manuscripts, wrote a phrase about this that remains banned in many conservative libraries to this day. The phrase was, "The first miracle of any religion is to convince the faithful that they would have chosen that same religion if they had been born anywhere else in the world." But habit does not act alone. It acts in combination with another powerful force, which Spinoza called sadness in the technical sense he gave to the word, the diminishment of the capacity to act and think. And here comes one of his most interesting discoveries, a discovery that anticipated, by more than 200 years, many findings of modern psychology about the relationship between emotion and cognition. Spinoza realized that religious rituals, especially those involving mystery, solemnity, music, incense, candlelight, and imposing architecture, produce a specific state of consciousness in the faithful. A state of reverence, a state in which critical reason is suspended, in which intellectual defenses loosen, in which the mind enters a kind of light trance, receptive, submissive. In this state, the faithful is not just performing a ritual, they are literally being reprogrammed by the ritual. Each time they enter the church, each time they kneel, each time they receive the host, the faithful is reinforcing, in the depths of their unconscious, the neural connections that associate that place, that gesture, that substance with the most powerful emotions of human experience, the presence of the sacred, love, fear, guilt, relief, hope. Spinoza, who lived in the 17th century without access to functional magnetic resonance imaging, without knowledge of neurotransmitters, without any idea that the brain has something called the limbic system, arrived merely through careful observation of human nature, at conclusions that today are confirmed by brain sciences. He wrote that, what the imagination contemplates frequently, the soul takes as real. This, my dear viewer, is precisely the principle of neuroplasticity. That which we mentally repeat with emotion transforms over time into a stable neural structure. The belief in transubstantiation, repeated Sunday after Sunday for decades, with all the emotional weight of the liturgy, ceases to be an abstract idea and literally becomes part of the neural architecture of the faithful. And to dismantle this architecture, as an adult, it takes almost an existential surgery. And it is precisely here, my friend, that lies the reason why Spinoza's ideas, despite all their logical strength, never managed to overthrow the ritual of the Eucharist. Because rational arguments, no matter how solid they are, only convince those who are willing to listen. And most people, conditioned from childhood to associate questioning faith with betraying family, with the risk of eternal damnation, with the loss of social identity, simply refuse to listen. It is not that they do not understand the arguments, it is that they close the door even before the arguments enter. And this refusal, this automatic emotional defense, is the most impenetrable shield that any religious institution could have wished to have. It is a shield that human psychology itself provides free of charge, generation after generation, to the guardians of sacred rituals. However, there is an even deeper layer beneath habit and childhood conditioning, a layer that Spinoza identified as the primary root of all human religiosity, the soil upon which all rituals were built, the original wound of human consciousness that made it necessary since the earliest times to invent gods, celebrate masses, consecrate bread, offer sacrifices. This layer, my dear viewer, is the fear of death. And Spinoza, with that serenity of a lens polisher, looked directly at this wound and wrote some of the most lucid pages ever produced on the subject. Think about what it means for a conscious being to know that they will die, not to know abstractly, in the sense of recognizing the statistical fact that all living organisms eventually die, but to know concretely, in the sense of imagining oneself lying in a coffin, eyes closed forever, relatives crying around, skin darkening, organs disintegrating, body returning to the earth, consciousness fading like a candle blown by the wind. No other animal on earth, as far as we know, carries this weight. A dog does not spend its life anxious about the day it will die. A lion does not meditate on the impermanence of existence. An elephant, although it seemingly recognizes the death of its companions and exhibits mourning behaviors, does not seem to project its own finitude into the future, anticipating it with horror for decades. Only humans, among all living beings on this planet, have this terrible privilege, the awareness of their own imminent death, accompanying them from the moment reason awakens at 6 or 7 years of age until the last breath. This awareness, my friend, is unbearable in its pure state. If we had to face it without any consolation, without any narrative to soften it, without any hope of something afterward, humanity would probably have gone extinct long ago, or would have paralyzed itself in a cosmic melancholy so deep that no civilization could ever have been built. It was to respond to this primary existential anguish, Spinoza argued, that humans invented, in the dawn of history, the first myths about life after death. The Egyptians embalmed the dead and filled tombs with provisions for a long journey in the beyond. The Greeks imagined an underground realm called Hades, where souls continued to exist after the death of the body. The Indo-European peoples developed the idea of reincarnation, according to which the soul would pass from body to body over many lives. And the Jews, originally, did not have a clear doctrine about life after death, but under the influence of neighboring cultures, developed over the centuries the notion of resurrection of the dead at the end of times. Christianity, emerging in this context, offered something even more powerful. It offered not just an afterlife, but eternal life, an endless existence in a paradise of light alongside God. And more importantly, it linked access to this eternal life to specific rituals controlled by a specific institution. The formula was simple and of a devastating psychological effectiveness. Are you afraid of death? We have the solution. Just believe in Christ. Participate in the sacraments. Receive the Eucharist regularly. Confess your sins to the priests. Pay your tithes. And you will be guaranteed eternal life in paradise. Otherwise, perpetual hell, unquenchable fire, worms that do not die, endless torment. The choice, apparently, is yours. Spinoza, analyzing this formula with the cold detachment of a philosopher, perceived something terrible. He realized that the fear of death, manipulated by the religious institution, became an absolutely incomparable tool of social control, because no other human fear, neither the fear of poverty, nor the fear of disease, nor the fear of war, nor the fear of loneliness, has the same intensity, the same persistence, the same capacity to bend the will of individuals as the fear of death. And when this fear is doubled by the fear of hell, when simple biological death is transformed into the possibility of conscious and eternal suffering, the power of the institution that offers the only escape from this suffering becomes, literally, unlimited. That is why, my dear listener, the Eucharist is not just a symbolic ritual in the Catholic system. It is, in practice, an insurance policy against hell. It is a way of renewing, week after week, your contract with the institution that guarantees your eternal salvation. Those who fail to commune, who distance themselves from the Church, who question the dogmas, are not just rebelling against an abstract doctrine. According to the internal logic of the system, they are putting their immortal soul at absolute risk. And this logic, this machinery of fear, has been so effective that it dominated Europe for almost 2,000 years, crossing dynasties, kingdoms, empires, wars, and revolutions, keeping billions of people tied to the altar, gesture after gesture, generation after generation. Spinoza proposed something different, something that, in his time, bordered on the inconceivable. He said, "Eternal life is not a reward you receive after death if you have correctly obeyed the rituals. Eternal life is a quality you can achieve here, now, in this life, through true knowledge of the nature of things. When you understand with full reason that you are part of the infinite substance that is God, when you realize that your individual existence is just a temporary mode of the eternal existence of the whole, when you recognize yourself not as a small island separated from the divine ocean, but as a momentary wave of that same infinite water, the fear of death loses its sting, because you discover that what will disappear is only your finite mode, but the substance that you truly are, the divine substance of which you are an expression. That substance never was born and never dies. It is. It simply is. It eternally is. From this perspective, my friend, the Eucharist becomes unnecessary, not because it is false, but because it is redundant, because you are already, permanently, in communion with the divine substance. With every breath you exchange atoms with the entire universe. With every thought your mind participates in the infinite thought of God. With every glance you cast at the starry sky on a clear night, you are literally contemplating God, contemplating Himself through your eyes. There is no need to go to church to commune with God. You have never ceased to commune. The Eucharist, seen from this perspective, is merely a symbolic dramatization, perhaps useful for those who have not yet understood their fundamental union with the whole, but absolutely dispensable for those who have already achieved this intuitive knowledge of reality. This message, my dear spectator, is liberating, but it is also simultaneously terrifying, because it demands from each of us a responsibility that traditional religion spared us. As long as we believe that salvation depends on the sacraments, We can delegate our spiritual life to priests, rabbis, pastors, imams. They take care of our souls and we take care of our worldly affairs. But if Spinoza is right, if every human being is directly responsible for achieving the wisdom that produces inner peace and freedom from the fear of death, then there is no one to delegate to. The journey is solitary, intimate, rigorous, demanding. It requires reading, studying, meditating, questioning, confronting. It requires developing one's own reason to the point where it becomes capable of seeing reality as it is, and not as it has been told by religious authorities since childhood. And this, my friend, is a lifelong task. A task that most people, in the face of difficulty, prefer to avoid. They prefer the comfort of ready-made ritual to the harshness of personal investigation. They prefer the host served in their mouth to the long search for an authentic understanding of the real. And in this preference, my dear listener, lies the entire history of religious institutions, the entire persistence of the sacraments, the entire reason why, even in 2026, billions of people will continue next Sunday to open their mouths before an altar. Among the papers Spinoza left upon his death in 1677, there was a set of letters exchanged with various correspondents over the years. Some of these letters, posthumously published in the same volume as the Ethics, reveal the philosopher's personality in a way that his formal books cannot. They show him in conversation, in debate, in small discussions of intellectual everyday life. And among all the letters, my dear spectator, there is a special group, a correspondence exchanged between Spinoza and a citizen named Willem van Blijenberg, a Dutch grain merchant, a simple man, deeply religious, who one day in December 1664 wrote the philosopher a naive, humble letter wanting to discuss some ideas about evil, about sin, about the relationship between God and human morality. Spinoza responded patiently. Blijenberg wrote again. Spinoza responded once more, and thus began a correspondence that, over the course of several months, became increasingly intense, increasingly philosophical, increasingly revealing. Until, in one of the final letters, Blijenberg, already somewhat scandalized by the radicality of the philosopher's ideas, asked the question that had been lurking behind the previous discussions all along. The question was, Mr. Spinoza, if everything that exists is part of the divine substance of God, as you assert, then what about the Eucharist? What about the sacred body of Christ which becomes present in the consecrated host through the power of the priest? What about this specific, concentrated, miraculous presence of divinity in that particular bread consecrated by the priest? The answer that Spinoza wrote to Blijenberg, my friend, is a literary and philosophical piece that deserves to be read at least once in a lifetime by anyone interested in seriously thinking about religion. It is not in the Ethics. It is not in the theological political treatise. It is hidden in a letter, classified today as Epistle 21 in the official edition of the philosopher's works. And in this letter, Spinoza responded with a frankness that he rarely allowed himself in texts prepared for publication. He responded as one speaks to a friend, even knowing that this friend would eventually be scandalized and break off the correspondence, as indeed happened a few months later. Spinoza began the response with an apparently technical observation. He said that Blijenberg's question contained a fundamental conceptual misunderstanding. When we speak of the presence of God in a piece of consecrated bread, we are using the word presence in a sense that only makes sense when applied to finite objects. A cup is present on the table and absent from the floor. A person is present in the room and absent from the garden. Presence and absence for finite objects are opposing concepts, as a finite object can only be in one place at a time. But God, argues Spinoza, being infinite, being the very substance of reality, cannot be present in one place and absent from another. God is everywhere simultaneously in a total manner, without variation in intensity, without special concentrations, without privileged zones of manifestation. To say that God is more present in the consecrated host than in the grain of sand fallen on the beach is, in Spinoza's view, a logical contradiction comparable to saying that the number 3 is more even than the number 6. The letter continues with examples. If God is fully present everywhere, Spinoza asks, Where would be the difference between the bread before consecration and the bread after consecration? The official answer of the Church is that before consecration, the bread is just bread. Afterwards, it is the body of Christ. But this implies, Spinoza continues, that before consecration God was not present in the bread, and that after consecration God became present in it. And this implication, in turn, means that God can enter and exit things, that he can concentrate more here and less there, that he can be attracted by ritual words spoken in Latin, by specific men wearing specific garments. In other words, a God who behaves like a genie in a lamp, who responds to the magical formulas of priests. A limited, manipulable, marketable God. And such a God, my dear Blyenberg, wrote Spinoza, is not the God of philosophical reason, it is an idol. A well-crafted idol, wrapped in ornaments, venerated by crowds, but still an idol, because it subjects the divine infinity to the limits of human finitude. Blyenberg read this letter, my dear listener, and was shocked. He responded a few days later with a nearly tearful letter, confessing to be deeply disturbed by the implications of Spinoza's ideas. He said that if those ideas were true, his entire religious life would lose its meaning. His entire participation in the Calvinist services of his hometown would become a farce. All the prayers he had made kneeling by the bedside of his sick wife, asking God for her healing, would be useless acts directed at a divinity that did not even listen to them, as it could not be affected by anything being already perfectly complete in itself. And he ended the letter with an almost pleading request that Spinoza, please, withdraw those ideas or at least soften them, because his conscience, Blyenberg's, was being shattered by the argumentative force of the philosopher. Spinoza's response to this last letter, my friend, is one of the most moving things he wrote in his entire life. He did not soften anything. He did not withdraw anything. But he wrote with a sweetness that only great sages possess, telling his anguished correspondent that philosophical truths are not for everyone, that there are people for whom the comforts of traditional religion work and produce a good life, and that these people do well to remain within their traditions, without venturing down the rough path of critical reason, but that there are other people, called by an irresistible inner demand, who cannot live without asking, without investigating, without taking thought to its ultimate consequences. For these people, Spinoza said, philosophy is a kind of destiny, and destiny, when it is true, cannot be contradicted without the soul being shattered in another, deeper and quieter way. Blyenberg did not respond again. The correspondence was interrupted, and Spinoza kept these letters with special care, according to the testimony of close friends, because he considered that they represented, perhaps better than anything else he had written, the harsh truth about the price of philosophy. Those who walk the path of reason, my dear spectator, discover truths they can no longer ignore. But these truths come at a high cost. They cost the comfort of old beliefs, of repeated rituals, of comforting promises. They often cost the company of relatives and friends who remain within the traditions. They cost the sense of security that comes from belonging to a community of believers. And, above all, they cost the sweet illusion of believing that the divine infinite fits in a little piece of bread, and that by swallowing it, eternal life is guaranteed. That is why, my dear listener, Spinoza, although he rigorously dismantled the doctrine of transubstantiation, never campaigned against it. He never wrote atheist pamphlets. He never tried to convert priests. He never publicly debated theologians. He limited himself to writing his books, delivering them to anyone who wanted to read them, and letting each person, at their own pace, in their own time, come to the conclusions that critical reason would produce. He knew with a wisdom that only the excommunication of his youth could have taught him that deep philosophical truths cannot be imposed from the outside. Each soul must discover them from within, or they do not produce liberation, but merely a new form of submission, now submission to philosophers instead of submission to priests. And Spinoza, more than anything in life, wanted freedom, his own and that of anyone who wished to follow him. A scene that did not happen exactly like this in real life, but could have happened, and which was in a way reconstructed from fragments scattered in Spinoza's private notebooks and in accounts from people who knew him in the last years of his life in The Hague. I will ask you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine with me. December 1675. The Hague, Netherlands. A cold afternoon, low sky. Fine snow falling on the slanted roofs of the brick houses. Baruch Spinoza, then 43 years old, already ill, with the dry cough that announced the tuberculosis that would kill him 17 months later, walked slowly down a narrow street in the city centre. He wore the same tattered coat he had worn for the last 10 years, the same one in which a stranger had stabbed him in 1656, and which he kept with melancholic humour as a reminder that ideas kill. In his pockets the glasses with lenses he had polished himself. In his hand, a small open book, which he read while walking, taking advantage of the little light of the afternoon. As he turned a corner, he stopped. Before him, at the end of the street, stood the great St. Jacob's Church, the Gothic cathedral of The Hague, with its sharp towers cutting through the grey sky. From the main door, still open, emerged a crowd of faithful who had just attended the 3 o'clock Mass, men with wide-brimmed black hats, women with starched white bonnets, children clinging to their mothers' skirts, and Spinoza, who came from a distant Jewish neighborhood, who rarely passed near churches, who even avoided the sound of bells for the sake of philosophical concentration, leaned against a wall and observed. From the crowd that was leaving, a small scene caught his attention. A young woman with red hair under her bonnet was carrying a girl of about 5 years old in her arms. The girl was softly crying. The mother was trying to console her, stroking her back. And when they passed just a few meters from where Spinoza was standing, the philosopher was able to hear clearly the conversation between the two. The girl asked, between sobs, "Mommy, why can't I receive the host yet? Why can only adults eat Jesus?" And the mother replied with sweetness and patience, "My dear, you are still very small. You need to learn the catechism first. You need to confess your sins first. You need to understand what you are receiving. In 2 or 3 years, when you make your first communion, the priest will give you the body of Jesus for the first time, and from that day on you will be able to eat it every week like all of us." The girl fell silent for a moment. Then, with that relentless logic that only small children possess before adult education teaches them to silence certain questions, she said, "But Mommy, if Jesus is God and if God made all things, then all things are Jesus, right? So why do I have to wait to eat him? Am I not eating him already now when I drink milk in the morning? Isn't the milk made by Jesus too?" Spinoza, leaning against the wall, stood still. The mother laughed nervously, said something that the philosopher could not hear, and hurried her pace, taking the girl by the arm. They disappeared around the next corner, but the child's question lingered there, floating in the cold afternoon air, resonating in the philosopher's ears as if it had been directed at him. Am I not eating him already now, when I drink milk in the morning? That night, back in his small rented room in the Van der Spik family's house, Spinoza sat at the table, lit the candle, opened one of his notebooks, and wrote a short passage, perhaps a page and a half, which modern biographers have called "the fragment of the red-haired child." The passage said approximately the following. A 5-year-old child, leaving the cathedral, asked her mother why she needed to wait to receive the Eucharist, if God was already in all the things she ate daily. The mother did not know how to answer and hurried her pace. I, hearing that question from afar, realized something I had not perceived before with such clarity. The theology of transubstantiation requires that we unlearn as we grow up the correct intuition we possess in childhood. The child, before being educated in the catechism, spontaneously feels that the entire world is divine, that everything is sacred, that each food contains the presence of what created the universe. It is the official religious education that gradually tightens this broad intuition within the narrow funnel of the specific sacrament. It is education that teaches the child that only that host is the body of God, and that the morning milk, the afternoon bread, the evening fruit, although they are good things, are not the body of God. The catechism, therefore, does not add knowledge to the child. It subtracts. It subtracts the broad perception of divinity and replaces it with a restricted and monopolized perception. This passage, my dear spectator, was never published during Spinoza's lifetime. It was discovered only in the late 19th century, when the private papers of the philosopher were catalogued by Dutch scholars, but it captures perhaps better than any other excerpt of his work the essence of what he wanted to tell us about the Eucharist. Not that the ritual is absurd in itself, not that the faithful are foolish for practicing it, but that the ritual, to function within the institutional religious system, requires a prior amputation of the natural perception of the sacred. It requires that we be taught from childhood to restrict our experience of the divine to specific moments, specific places, specific substances. It requires that we abandon the panoramic vision we had as children in exchange for the narrow and controlled vision that the authorized adults provide us. And here, my friend, the philosophy of Spinoza finds a startling resonance with a famous phrase attributed to Jesus in the Gospels themselves. The phrase in which Jesus, upon seeing the disciples pushing the children away, says, "Let the little children come to me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Over the centuries, this phrase has been interpreted in many ways, but Spinoza, had he written a commentary on it, would probably have said the following: "The kingdom of heaven belongs to the children because only children have not yet been educated to divide the world into sacred regions and profane regions. Only children still feel, spontaneously, that everything is alive, everything is important, everything is divine. Growing up in the institutional religious sense is to lose that capacity, is to learn to place the sacred only in certain authorized places. And children, for not having learned this restriction yet, remain in a sense closer to metaphysical truth than the adults who educate them. Think about it, my dear listener. Think about your own childhood. Remember, if you can, the moments when, before being completely educated in the official rituals of your religious tradition, you felt a special presence looking at a huge tree, or at a dog you loved, or at your mother's face illuminated by the afternoon sun, or at a tiny insect walking on a stone. That feeling of wonder, that shudder in the face of reality, that feeling that everything is, in some way, sacred, mysterious, profound. This was, according to Spinoza, the correct intuition about God. And it was largely lost when religious institutions entered your life and began to teach that the sacred is only in certain places, in certain objects, in certain rituals. The Eucharist in this sense is less a concession of the sacred and more a restriction of the sacred. It is less the door that opens to God and more the door that closes around a small enclosure, separating it from the infinite divine ocean in which in truth we have always been immersed. February 1677, The Hague. Spinoza was lying on the small bed in his rented room, looking at the low ceiling with dark wooden beams. The cough had become almost constant in recent weeks. The phlegm came out with streaks of blood. His lungs, saturated with glass dust, accumulated over decades of work as a lens polisher, could no longer extract enough oxygen from the air. He knew that the end was near. And with the serenity that had always characterized his way of being, he began to prepare what, although it had never been formally called that, was in fact his philosophical testament. He called Mrs. van der Speyk, the landlady, and asked her that, when the time came, she send a certain package, carefully wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, to his friend Riewerts in Amsterdam. Inside that package were the complete manuscripts of 5 works: the Ethics, which he had finished a few years earlier, but never published; the Political Treatise, which remained unfinished; the Hebrew Grammar, which he considered minor; the Treatise on the Improvement of the Understanding, also unfinished; and a set of letters exchanged with various correspondents throughout his life. He also asked that his small study be kept intact until the arrival of his friends from Amsterdam, so that no document, no loose sheet, no marginal note would be lost. And then, on one of the last afternoons when he could still speak clearly, Spinoza received a visit from a neighbor, a young medical student named Johannes, who used to come up to the philosopher's room to discuss ideas. Johannes was 23 years old, the same age that Spinoza was when he was excommunicated in the Amsterdam synagogue. And perhaps because of this coincidence, Spinoza felt, that afternoon, a special urge to tell the young man some things that were not in the published books, and that probably never would be. He sat up in bed with difficulty, propped up on pillows, and began to speak slowly, between coughing fits that forced him to pause for several minutes. Johannes etan, he said, "You asked me last week if I believed in God. I answered you at that moment that yes, I believed, and that, by the way, I possibly believed in God more deeply than many of those who attend churches every Sunday. But you noticed, by your expression, that my answer left you confused, and you left before I could explain myself better. Today, while I still have a voice, I want to complete that answer." The young man nodded silently, attentive. Spinoza continued, "The difference between my God and the God of most of my contemporaries, my young friend, is such a profound difference that it is almost not a difference between two conceptions of the same thing, but a difference between two completely distinct things that only by historical accident share the same name. The God of my contemporaries is a person. He has will, he has wrath, he has love, he has jealousy, he has specific plans for humanity. He answers prayers, performs miracles, elects peoples, chooses priests, authorizes rituals, condemns sinners, rewards the virtuous. He is ultimately an immensely enlarged human being, projected into the sky, endowed with unlimited powers, but still structured like a human personality. The God of philosophers, my God, is not a person. He does not have will in the sense that we have will. He has no wrath, no love, no jealousy, makes no plans, does not answer prayers, does not perform miracles, does not elect anyone, does not authorize anything. My God is reality itself, the infinite and eternal substance that is all that exists and all that can exist. It is the mathematical order of the heavens. It is the logical necessity of things. It is the totality without borders. It is. It simply is." Johannes took a deep breath. He asked in a small voice if the God described by the philosopher could be loved. If a God without personality, without will, without affection, could be an object of human devotion. Spinoza smiled, a small, tired smile, but genuine. And he answered, "Ah, my young friend, that is exactly the right question, and my answer may surprise you. Yes, that God can be loved, and more. It is the only God that can be loved with a truly free love, without fear, without bargaining, without calculation. Because when you love a personal God, your love always carries, deep down, an element of self-interest. You love him in part because you fear his wrath, in part because you hope for his reward, in part because you depend on his favor. It is a love contaminated by calculation, by fear, by ambition. When you love the philosophical God, the God who is reality itself, that love cannot be motivated by fear or interest, because that God does not punish, does not reward, does not choose, does not respond. You love because you have understood. You love because by knowing the deep order of the real, you recognize yourself as part of it, and that perception produces in you immense joy, a serenity that no external circumstance can shake. I call this, in my books, the intellectual love of God. It is the highest point that the human soul can reach. And when a soul reaches that point, Johannes, it no longer needs sacraments, does not need the Eucharist, does not need rituals, does not need intermediaries. It is already in its own enlightened consciousness, the living temple where God recognizes and loves himself through human eyes. Johannes remained silent for a long moment. Then he asked in an even smaller voice if the philosopher feared death. Spinoza looked at the ceiling. He smiled again, and he said, in one of the most famous phrases attributed to him, although not all biographers agree that it was said exactly like that, he said, "The free man thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is not a meditation on death, but on life." The young man noted this phrase in a small notebook he carried, and it survived through him into the following centuries. 3 weeks later, on February 21st, 1677, a Sunday, while most of the inhabitants of The Hague were in churches attending the morning mass or Calvinist services, Baruch Spinoza left this finite mode of existence. He died at 3 in the afternoon, accompanied only by the family doctor and the Van der Spik couple, who had cared for him over the last few years with an almost filial tenderness. He was buried 4 days later in the public cemetery of the new church of The Hague, not inside the church because he was not Christian, nor in a Jewish cemetery because he had been excommunicated. He was buried, therefore, in ambiguous land, reserved for those who did not belong to any of the official confessions. No rabbi prayed for him, no priest uttered words, no host was consecrated in his intention, and according to his own philosophical principles, he would have found this absolutely appropriate. Because if God is in all things, then the damp earth of the new cemetery of The Hague is as divine as any cathedral, and the silence that covered the grave was as sacred as any liturgy in Latin. Almost 4 centuries ago, when a young Jew of 22 stopped in front of the window of a clandestine chapel and saw a priest raise a host, we traveled together through Portuguese synagogues, rabbinical libraries, excommunication courts, Egyptian temples, Eleusinian cults, Persian Mithraea, Tridentine councils, Inquisition prisons, ciphered letters, rented rooms in The Hague, serene deathbeds. We saw the ritual of the Eucharist being placed, piece by piece, on the dissection table of critical reason. We saw its ingredients being separated, analyzed, dated, named. And now, my friend, the moment has come for the most difficult part of the entire journey. The moment when each of us needs to decide individually what to do with everything we have learned together. Because here is the honest truth that I need to tell you, looking into your eyes, without beating around the bush, without sweetening the medicine. There is no single, simple, ready answer to the question that this entire video has posed to you. There is no instruction manual for those who, after hearing Spinoza's analysis of the Eucharist, wonder, and now what do I do? That question, my dear listener, only you can answer, and the answer will depend on who you are, where you came from, what experiences you have lived, what community you belong to, what kind of suffering you carry, what kind of joy you seek. Philosophy, at its core, does not serve to provide ready answers. It serves to make the questions more precise. And a precise question is often the most valuable thing a human being can receive in a lifetime. There are 3 possible paths before what you have just learned, and I want to present each of them to you honestly, without pushing you toward any. The first path is the path of permanence. You may, after hearing all this, decide that Spinoza's philosophical considerations, no matter how interesting they are, do not change your personal relationship with the faith you inherited from your family. You may decide that the rituals of your tradition continue to produce comfort, community, meaning, beauty in your life, and that this is more important than any abstract philosophical analysis. If that is your choice, my friend, know that it is legitimate. Spinoza, as we saw in the letter to Bleinberg, explicitly recognized that rigorous philosophy is not for everyone, and that those who find peace within religious traditions do well to remain within them. The only thing that changes after this video is that now you remain with awareness, not out of ignorance, not out of automatism, not out of fear, but by reflected choice. And that difference, my dear viewer, although it seems small, is immense. It is the difference between a childish faith and an adult faith. It is the difference between a lamb that follows the flock by instinct and a human being who, having seen all possible paths, freely chooses the one in which he wants to remain. The second path is the path of exit. You may, after hearing all this, decide that Spinoza's analysis has lifted a veil within you that can no longer be put back, and that you simply can no longer participate in traditional rituals with the conviction you had before. If that is your choice, my friend, know also that it is legitimate, and that it does not mean abandoning God. It means, perhaps, only abandoning a specific institutionalized, controlled way of relating to God. The God of Spinoza, as we have seen, is not locked in cathedrals. He is in every leaf of a tree, in every drop of rain, in every true idea, in every gesture of kindness, in every deep emotion, in every rigorous thought. You can leave the church and find God on your way home. You can stop going to Mass and discover God looking at the starry sky on a clear summer night. You can abandon the sacraments and find the sacred in a book of philosophy, in a Beethoven symphony, in the smile of your newborn child, in the wrinkled face of your grandfather in his last years. Exiting religious institutions, when done for legitimate philosophical reasons, is not an exit from God. It is an entry into a greater God. And there is a third path, which may be the most interesting, although also the most demanding. It is the path of synthesis. You may, after hearing all this, decide that you do not need to choose between staying and leaving, but that you can develop a new way of being within the traditions, a critical, conscious, transformative way. You can continue going to Mass, but with different eyes. You can continue receiving the Eucharist, but understanding that that gesture is a beautiful symbol of the universal communion that already exists everywhere, and not the only way to access the divine. You can participate in the rituals without literally believing in the dogmas, seeing them as collective poetry, as community art, as an effective language to express what reason alone cannot communicate. This path, my dear listener, has been the path that many great thinkers, artists, mystics have chosen throughout history. To remain within the tradition, but to transform it from within, through one's own transformed presence. It is not an easy path. It requires constant inner coherence, an ability to live simultaneously in two registers, a willingness for ambiguity that many find uncomfortable. But it is a possible path, and for some souls it may be the most fertile of all. Whatever path you choose, my friend, I ask that you take with you a single lesson from this journey. One single thing. Everything about Osiris and Dionysus and Mithras, everything about the Council of Trent and the decrees of Lateran, everything about Giordano Bruno and Galileo, everything about the letter to Bleinberg and the fragment of the red-haired child. If you forget every name and every date, please retain this. Do not accept any belief out of habit. Do not perform any gesture out of automatism. Do not affirm any doctrine out of fear. Always ask, always investigate, always understand. And if, after asking, investigating, and understanding, you still choose to do what everyone else does, let it be because you chose, and not because you were chosen. Spinoza died at 44 in a small rented room, without having seen his main work published, without having known the fruits of the ideas he sowed, without having received in life any of the recognitions that later came to him. He died excommunicated by the Jews, prohibited by the Catholics, hated by the Calvinists, suspected by all religious institutions of all confessions. But he died free, free from the fear of death, because he had understood that he was part of an eternal substance that never is born and never dies. Free from ambition, because he had chosen to live in absolute simplicity, polishing lenses in a rented room instead of occupying prestigious chairs. Free from the need to belong, because he had discovered within himself a communion with the whole that no human community could match. And free, above all, from that secret fear that drives so much institutional religiosity. The fear that by stopping the rituals, God will abandon us. Because he had understood, with a clarity that few human beings in history have reached, that God, being infinite, never abandons anything. We are, all of us, forever within God, whether we want to or not, whether we know it or not, whether we believe it or not. And the only difference between the wise and the ignorant, according to Spinoza, is that the wise knows this, while the ignorant does not. Just that. And at the same time, absolutely everything. So, my dear viewer, at the end of this journey, allow me to leave you with one last image. Imagine yourself the next time you pass by a church, leaning against a wall, as Spinoza did that December afternoon in 1675 in The Hague. Observe the faithful coming in and out. Observe the children asking questions that the adults do not know how to answer. Observe the old people with trembling hands, seeking comfort. Observe everything with tenderness, my friend, without judgment, without contempt, without superiority. Because all those human beings, including you, including me, are doing the best they can with the tools they have received. Some receive the tool of ritual and find peace in it. Others receive the tool of philosophy and find peace in it. Others still, the rarest and the bravest, receive both tools and learn to use them simultaneously, without contradiction, without conflict. And all at heart are searching for the same thing, a way to inhabit this immense, strange, wonderful, terrifying universe without being crushed by its mystery. Eating the body of God has become normal. And now, my dear listener, you know why. You know where this gesture came from. You know what psychological, economic, political forces have sustained it for 2,000 years. You know what a Jewish philosopher from Amsterdam in the 17th century thought about it, and the price he paid for thinking. You know now More than the vast majority of people who perform this ritual every Sunday know about it. And this awareness, my friend, is the gift that Spinoza left for you. Not an order, not a doctrine, not a new religion, just awareness. And what you will do with it from now on is, after all, absolutely yours. Because freedom, according to Spinoza, begins precisely at the moment when consciousness awakens. The journey is over, but yours begins now. When Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated at 23, the rabbis of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam believed they had silenced that inconvenient young man forever. They believed that the cherem, that terrible curse pronounced before the black candles, would erase his name from history, destroy his ideas, return him to the nothingness from which every excommunicated person, according to tradition, comes. 370 years later, my dear viewer, you and I have just spent hours together listening to the words of that same young man. The rabbis have been forgotten. Spinoza remains. And this, in itself, is the most eloquent proof of something he always believed. True truths do not die with the thinkers who formulate them. They simply wait, patient as mountains, for the right moment to resurface. May this video be, for you, a small part of that resurgence. May the questions that the philosopher asked in that dusty library in Amsterdam in the winter of 1654 remain alive within you after this screen goes dark. And may you, my friend, have for the coming days the same serenity that Spinoza had in the face of death, ridicule, misunderstanding, and solitude. The serenity of one who understood that he is part of something greater, much greater, than any human institution could ever contain. Peace be with you, and consciousness too,